Okay, let's go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, the Atom Seminar has the great pleasure to welcome Professor Jeffrey Errington. Professor Errington holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University at Buffalo and a PhD degree in chemical engineering from the Cornell University. Currently, he is a professor within the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering at the University at Buffalo. He also serves as the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education within the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Prior to joining the University at Buffalo, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Chemical Engineering at Princeton University. His current projects focus on the prediction of interfacial properties associated with carbon dioxide sequestration, understanding wetting phenomena related to enhanced oil recovery, and probing the phase and interfacial behaviors of room temperature ionic liquids. His group is also active in the development of free energy-based molecular simulation methods for computing the interfacial properties of model systems. He is a member of the American Chemical Society and a senior member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. So once again, welcome, Professor Errington. Thank you so much for being here, and you can feel free to start your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and get started here. All right. All right, let me begin by thanking Fred Tavares and his team for putting together this wonderful seminar series. It's really quite a nice contribution to the community and well appreciated. Also, thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk and tell you a little bit about some of the things that our group is working on at the moment. All right, so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study that we engaged in that looks at the wetting behavior of water in the vicinity of membranes that are grafted with zwitterionic polymers. And as I'll explain in a moment, much of this work was motivated by a collaborator here at the University at Buffalo. So the team that worked on this, Yichi Chen, I'll say more about him in a moment. He was a graduate student with us. Andrew Schultz, who is a research professor here at the University at Buffalo that our group works closely with, and myself. So as I mentioned, the lead author is Yichi Chen. Yichi was an outstanding graduate student with us. He has now moved on to a startup company, but much of the work that in fact, all of the work that I'm going to be presenting today is related to the work associated with his dissertation. All right, the work that I'll discuss today stemmed from a collaboration with Professor Haiqing Lin's group at the University at Buffalo. So Professor Lin's group, a lot of the work that they do has to do with polymer membranes for various different applications. One of the applications that they were looking into was the use of polymer membranes for wastewater treatment technologies. And one of the issues associated with that is that you have these polymer membranes and using them to separate the water. And over time, due to contaminants that are within the wastewater, the membranes foul and become less effective. So what Professor Lin's group had looked into was this idea of taking the base structures associated with these membranes and coating them with a polymer, and moreover then adding to that polymer coating these zwitterionic polymers as grafted tethers. And they had done some studies within their group. So this is the permeance of water through one of these membrane systems as a function of time. And the idea is that these are various different membranes that are exposed to some sort of wastewater. And effectively, you're measuring how effective the membranes are as a function of time. And what they had found was that the uncoated, or those coated with just a base polymer, are less effective than those that are, in addition to the base polymer, have these zwitterionic tethers associated with them. So here you can see there's a higher level of permeance, a higher level of effectiveness associated with these zwitterionic tethered polymers. So they came to us, and they were interested in understanding a couple of different aspects of these systems. So one was that they were interested in sort of the base thermodynamic properties associated with these. So in this context, the sort of differences in the wetting behavior of water in the vicinity of these different types of polymer membranes. And they were also interested in the sort of structure and the dynamics of water within the vicinity of these zwitterionic tethered polymer systems. So what we'll discuss today is related to attempting to get a better understanding of the thermodynamic properties associated with these systems, as well as the structural and dynamic properties related to these systems. So in terms of Yichi's work, the first project that I'll outline is one in which we focused on the thermodynamic and wetting behavior of these systems. The second project I'll focus on is one that is related to better understanding the structure and dynamics of water in the vicinity of these polymeric systems. And then a third project that Yichi took on was sort of taking a step back and looking at these a bit more generally in terms of trying to understand some of the finer details in terms of how things like the fractional coverage of the polymer tethers starts to influence things like the wetting behavior and the structure and dynamics of water. All right, so again, just to sort of frame this slightly differently, we're looking at these zwitterionic materials. The sort of advantages are that they are biocompatible, and within the membrane community, there has been sort of developed this idea that they can perform as better anti-fouling agents. And so, you know, sort of the place that we start is that you have some sort of material surface, you add to it these polymer tethers. And again, the idea is that they do a better job in terms of anti-fouling relative to non-ionic tether graphs. Okay, so as I suggested before, the first project that Yichi took on was one in which we look to determine the wetting properties associated with these systems and how the properties evolve as you look at different polymer tethers, different chemical identities, for example, and later on we'll talk about what happens if you have different sort of fractional coverage of the different polymer tethers. So the first thing that we did was to ask Professor Lin and his group, okay, what are some reasonable polymers to study? What do you guys actually use? And he had indicated to us at the time that in terms of this sort of base polymer here, one of the structures that they use and that they suggested was this polysulfone. So we said, okay, we'll go ahead and use that. That seems reasonable. So here is the chemical structure of one of these monomers. And so our first task was to figure out how to develop a base polymer membrane within the context of a molecular simulation. So what we did was to take a simulation box that was constrained 40 angstroms by 40 angstroms in terms of a cross-sectional area, was a confined system. we made it to begin with relatively high in height. On the bottom of it, we put a Leonard Jones 9.3 structuralist surface. And the basic idea was we just wanted something there to be sort of sticky in some sense and be a place for the polymers to naturally sort of start to aggregate, if you will. And then we put into the simulation box 24 polysulfone 3-mer chains. And we then went through a process in which we started off with a temperature of something like 1,000 or 1,200 Kelvin, and over time we reduced the temperature down to 300 Kelvin. During that process, the thickness of the polymer film, so this thickness here, decreased as we decreased the temperature, it became effectively more dense, and the final structure that we got to at 300 Kelvin is the one that you're seeing here. So you can see, there's a little bit of roughness in terms of the surface at the top. This is the sort of surface here that we're now going to expose to water, as well as make it such that we graft the polymer tethers onto this surface as well. So that's the process that we use in order to develop the sort of base membrane that we work with. As I mentioned before, one of the keys was that we wanted to compare sort of the base membrane to different polymer tethered surfaces. And we were interested in understanding the differences between the performance of different zwitterionic types of polymer grafts, as well as non-zwitterionic polymer grafts. And so, again, we turned to Professor Lin's group and asked for some suggestions in terms of what to use. And they had indicated that a couple of the ones that they work from a non-ionic perspective are polyethylene glycol acrylate and polyethylene glycol methyl ethyl acrylate. So we'll call those PEG-A and PEG-MEA. And then on the zwitterionic side, they had been working with sulfobutene methacrylate and carboxybutene methacrylate, so SBMA and CBMA. So you'll notice that for both of the zwitterionic polymer chains, you have a cation entity sort of in the interior of the polymer, and then the anionic component of it is at the exterior of the polymer chain. So the next question was, okay, how do we graft these on? And so what Ichi did was an analysis to determine eligible grafting spots at the surface of this base membrane that we had created. And to do that, he was looking for ones that were exposed to the environment. In other words, they weren't embedded within the polymer structure, and ones that were sort of at, pointing upwards at the surface, ones that we could naturally graft something on. And so when he did that analysis, he identified 14 different grafting sites, and we then grafted polymers onto those 14 different sites. And so in the end, a typical structure that we have looks something like this. So this is the base polymer membrane with, in this case, PEG-MEA tethers associated with it. So this ended up being then the structure that we used in order to further examine the wetting properties, as well as at a later point, the structural and dynamic properties of water in the vicinity of these different structures. Okay, so at this point now, we have the model, the base model, we have the polymer tethered models as well. And so now what we would like to do is to develop a means to determine the wetting properties of the system. So within our group, for a number of years, we've used this interface potential type of approach, and the sort of traditional way that we've implemented that is a way in which one does a grand canonical simulation, and you capture the particle number distribution associated with the fluid that you're trying to learn something more about. And you can take that particle number probability distribution and translate that into what we refer to as an interface potential. So at the end of the day, really what we wanted to do was a grand canonical simulation where we specify the temperature of the system, the volume of the system, and the activity of water. In this case, we want to set the activity of water at the bulk liquid vapor activity, since this is the activity that's relevant when you are determining the wetting properties of the system. But we have this sort of complicated system in which you have these polymer tethers associated with it, and we wanted to allow the polymer tethers to sample different configurations during the simulation. And for sort of the sake of simplicity, we assumed in this case that the base structure just remained static. So we wanted some way of sampling these polymer tether configurations during the simulation. Doing that through Monte Carlo. I mean, of course, there are ways. I see Professor Theodoro is here. He's developed many ways to do that, but in general, it's sort of a challenging thing to do. And at the same time, we wanted to use Monte Carlo to be able to conduct the grand canonical Monte Carlo, which would be helpful in terms of determining the wetting properties of the system, specifically in this case, this particle number probability distribution. So what we ended up doing in the end was using this hybrid Monte Carlo molecular dynamics type of approach, in which we spent some time doing a canonical molecular dynamics simulation. So during one of these canonical simulations, the polymer tethers can sample different configurations. And then at some point, we would stop that. We'd take the output configuration from that, and we would use that as the input to a short grand canonical Monte Carlo simulation. During that, we would allow the water to displace into different positions. We would have water molecule particle insertions and deletions, but the polymer base membrane and tethers would remain static during those simulations. So we repeated this cycle something on the order of 200 times. In terms of some details, the Monte Carlo portion of it was completed with our own sort of group code, and the molecular dynamics part of it was completed using the LAMPS software. All right, so at the end of the day, once we go through that process, again, the sort of desirable output for us is this particle number probability distribution within the grand canonical ensemble. And it turns out that if you take the negative of the logarithm of that, you end up with what we refer to as the interface potential within the context of interfacial thermodynamics. So what we're showing here is the interface potential for one of the two different ways in which we implement these types of simulations. One approach is what we call the spreading approach. And in the spreading approach, we grow a thin film from the surface. So in this case, we're growing a thin film of water from the polymer membrane surface. And we've taken this particle number probability distribution, and here we've just converted it. Instead of using the particle number, we're using the thickness of the liquid water film associated with the film. So once you have one of these interface potentials, it can tell you qualitative and quantitative information about the wetting behavior. From a qualitative perspective, you'll notice here that this particular interface potential is one in which you have a minimum at relatively small film thicknesses, and that minimum then continues on to sort of this plateau region, which corresponds to the relatively thick fluid films. So if you have that type of situation in which you have this minimum that emerges, that tells you that the system is in the partial wetting regime. In other words, from a macroscopic perspective, the fluid would form a droplet on the surface. In contrast, as we'll see examples later, if you have a situation in which this interface potential monotonically decreases and then plateaus out, in other words, there's no minimum, then that is a signature that the system is in the complete wetting regime. In other words, if you take the fluid and you put it onto the surface, it will spread evenly across the surface. From a quantitative perspective, if the system is within this partial wetting regime, then the distance between this plateau region and this minimum region here is related to the spreading coefficient, which is a standard quantity within interfacial thermodynamics. And this spreading coefficient is related to the interfacial tensions between the solid and the vapor phase, the liquid in the vapor phase, and the solid in the liquid phase. So specifically here, this distance is related to beta, so that's 1 over kT times the spreading coefficient. In this case, this is an intensive spreading coefficient, and it's multiplied by the area. In this case, it's the cross-sectional area associated with the surface. Okay, so that is the sort of main output that we get from one of these spreading simulations. We also do another form of the simulation in which we do a so-called drying simulation. So here, what we look at is the growth of a, let me just change my pointer for a second. Okay, so for the drying simulations, we look at the growth of a thin vapor phase in the vicinity of the surface. In this case, the mother liquid, if you will, or the mother fluid, if you will, is the liquid phase. And so we're growing a thin film from the surface, a thin vapor film from the surface, and we're looking what happens to the free energy during that growth process. So again, if you have a potential in which there's a minimum in it, that signifies that the system is in this partial wetting regime. And again, you can use the difference between the plateau region and the minimum in the potential to determine a key interfacial property. In this case, we refer to it as the drying coefficient. It's a different sort of mix of the interfacial tensions between the solid liquid, liquid vapor, and solid vapor phases. So a couple things to note is that once you have the spreading coefficient and the drying coefficient, either one of them in combination with the liquid vapor interfacial tension could be used to determine the contact angle. If you go through a process in which you do both a spreading calculation and a drying calculation at the same state conditions, then the combination of those two can be used to determine both the contact angle associated with a fluid droplet at the surface, as well as the liquid vapor interfacial tension. So in many instances, being able to sort of independently determine this liquid vapor interfacial tension is helpful in the sense that it provides a useful check with other studies that have determined, in this case, water, the liquid vapor interfacial tension for that model. You can make sure that you're sort of on track. Okay, so that's the sort of methodology that we used. So the images that I showed here are associated with the base membrane. Just a couple images here. This gives you a sense of what these look like for the polymer tethered surfaces. So this would be sort of something in this minimum regime of the spreading type of approach, and this is in the plateau regime. And Yichi also put together a video to give an idea of how the system samples during one of the molecular dynamics simulations. And so if you take a look at one of the polymer tethers, you can sort of see that during one of these molecular dynamics components, the polymer tethers do evolve quite a bit, and we get good sampling of them during one of these simulations. Okay, so now let's take a look at the results. So as I mentioned before, we had constructed a base surface, and then we had constructed surfaces with these 4 different types of polymer tethers. And we want to get a sense of how the wetting properties now vary for those different types of surfaces. We started the calculations at 500 Kelvin, and then as I'll explain in a moment, we went through a process in which we explored the free energies of the system down to room temperature. The reason why we start at 500 Kelvin is that it's simply easier to sample the system at these elevated temperatures in order to do the direct calculations, and then we use other methods to sort of drill down to lower temperatures. So it's more done essentially for an efficiency perspective. Okay, so here are the different interface potentials, and what are these telling us? Well, if we look at just the base surface, you have an interface potential that has one of these global minimums, turns into a plateau. So that's telling you that the base surface, as well as the two systems, so the orange color here and the green color, both of those are for the polymer tethers that are non-zwitterionic in nature. So all three of those systems have this minimum in the interface potential followed by a plateau region. So the qualitative conclusion that we come to is that all three of those systems would end up being in the partial wetting regime. In other words, if you put a fluid onto that surface, the liquid water would bead up into a droplet. In contrast, if you look at the two cases in which we have the zwitterionic polymers tethered to the surface, in that case, you do not have a minimum associated with the interface potential, and so you would conclude that these systems are in the complete wetting regime. In other words, again, if you put a liquid water onto the surface, it would spread evenly across one of these membranes. If we translate this into quantitative numbers, the base PSF membrane has a contact angle of around 47 degrees. The PEG A1, 25 degrees, and the most hydrophobic system is that with the PEG MEA, which has a contact angle of 64. So this PEG MEA, you may have noticed before, has sort of a methyl group at the end. And so sort of just qualitatively, one can understand that how that system may be a bit more hydrophobic in nature. So the sort of hierarchy in terms of the sort of wetting characteristics that we would conclude, or you have the two zwitterionic ones, and then as you go from left to right here, the system becomes more hydrophobic in nature. As I alluded to before, we then went through a process in which we captured the free energies of the various different states, so the minimum state and the plateau region as a function of temperature. And that allowed us to determine spreading coefficients and drying coefficients as a function of temperature, and therefore contact angles as a function of temperature. And so here are the contact angles as a function of temperature for the base polysulfone surface, as well as the two non-zwitterionic polymer tethered systems. We see a pretty typical curve here in terms of the sort of variation in the contact angle with temperature. We've seen this in some other systems as well. You tend to see sort of a decrease in the cosine of the contact angle at temperatures near room temperature as you increase the temperature, and then oftentimes see this sort of minimum, and then as you go to higher temperatures, the cosine of the contact angle going up. Overall, though, if you sort of take a look at these, the variation in the contact angle with temperature over this relatively wide range of temperature is not all that significant. And so in the end, we see sort of the same rank order in terms of the wettability of the surface at room temperature as we did at 500 Kelvin. As I mentioned before, one of the other outputs that you can get from this type of approach, if you use both a spreading approach and drying approach, is information about the liquid vapor surface tension, in this case, liquid vapor surface tension of water. So here we're using an SPCE model for water, and we're able now to compare the results that we're getting to other literature results. And you can see that there's good agreement with literature results, and that provides just a bit of confidence that we're doing these calculations correctly, and we're getting the results that are consistent with previous studies for those properties where we can make a meaningful comparison. All right, so to conclude this first part, we were able to successfully construct models for this base polysulfone membrane, as well as the grafted surfaces. To be honest, we really didn't know where to start with respect to this. This was sort of a new area for us and wasn't a lot in the literature. So we'd certainly be interested in feedback in terms of whether this was a reasonable thing to do, or suggestions in terms of other ways of creating such models moving forward. And then we were able to successfully obtain the interfacial properties of these systems using this sort of coupled molecular Monte Carlo molecular dynamics type of approach. And in terms of the actual polymers themselves, we found that the systems that had the Zwitterionic tethers had much stronger affinity for water. They were much more in the sort of wetting scenario relative to the other systems involved. All right, so after that, we wanted to learn a little bit more about sort of what is going on with water in the vicinity of these polymer tethers and in the vicinity of the base polysulfone surface. So what we did was a molecular dynamics study in which we looked at these systems where you have a relatively thick layer of water that covers the polymer membrane. And we then wanted to look at different structural and dynamic metrics to better understand the nature of the system under these different conditions. So for this, I was reminded of some of the work that I did with Pablo de Benedetti when I was a postdoc. So at that time, we were interested in understanding the structure and dynamics of water in the vicinity of various different carbohydrates. And so we ended up using a number of the same sort of methods and approaches that were pursued at that time. But in this case, we're just applying them to these polymer tethered membranes instead of carbohydrates. So some of the things that we explored were metrics that tell us something about the residence time of water in the vicinity of the polymer tethers. We also looked at metrics that tell us something about the translational and rotational dynamics in the vicinity of the polymer tethers. And then we also looked at some metrics related to the hydrogen bond network that water forms with the polymer tethers. So going into this, we wanted to be able to say something about water in the vicinity of one of the tethers versus water in the vicinity of the base surface. And so what Ichi did was to come up with this sort of approach in which we identified different regions. So region 1 is water in the vicinity of the base polysulfone surface. So it's water that is within 5 angstroms of one of the heavy atoms associated with the base membrane. Region 2, which is where most of our focus was, is water that is within 5 angstroms of one of the heavy atoms associated with the polymer tether, but at least 5 angstroms away from the base surface. And then region 3 is everything else. So you can sort of think of region 3 as somewhat like the sort of bulk water associated with the system. All right, so what I'll do now is just share some of the results associated with these different metrics that we captured and how that relates to some of the wetting behavior that we observed. So the first thing that we're looking at here has to do with the diffusivity of water in the vicinity of these polymer tethers. So again, we're focusing on this region 2. And what Ichi captured was a measure of the diffusivity as a function of the distance of water from the polymer tether. And if you just sort of look in aggregate at the curve here, the first thing that you notice is that the water dynamics slow, as water approaches the polymer tether. So close to the polymer tether, the mobility of water is relatively low. Away, of course, it approaches that in the bulk. If you look even closer at the differences between the various different polymer tethers, one notices that the dynamics associated with the two Zwitterionic polymers are slower than those associated with the two non-Zwitterionic polymers. The next thing that we looked at was the rotational dynamics. And so here we captured the rotational correlation time. And again, we captured this as a function of the distance that water is from one of the heavy atoms associated with the polymer chain. So again, just sort of in aggregate, if you look, the water, the time correlation decreases as you move away from the polymer tether. So in other words, the water becomes less mobile as you approach the polymer tether. And again, if you look carefully at the different identities of the polymers, the Zwitterionic ones have a more significant impact on the mobility, rotational mobility of water. The rotational mobility is slowed even further for these Zwitterionic cases relative to the non-Zwitterionic cases. Next, we look at the residence time. So here we're sort of capturing the system at time t equals to 0, and then we're asking the question, is water still within close proximity to one of the polymer tethers at some time t later? And that information gives us the time correlation function. So here's the time correlation function associated with the different polymer tethers. Here again, you notice that the correlation times associated with the Zwitterionic polymers are higher than those associated with the non-Zwitterionic polymers, again, suggesting lower measures of mobility for water closer to the Zwitterionic polymer tethers. Next was the hydrogen bond analysis. And here we're doing something similar. So we're asking or identifying all of the hydrogen bonds at time t equals to 0 between water and the polymer tether. And then we're asking at some time later, does that hydrogen bond still exist? And that information is used to construct, again, another correlation function. So this is that correlation function. Again, we're looking at it for the different polymer tethers. And again, one notices that for the two Zwitterionic polymers, the correlation times are higher. In this case, you can see sort of a definitive difference also between CBMA and SBMA, CBMA being the one that slows the mobility of water, in this case, even more than that of SBMA. All right, I think I'll skip this. So what all of these suggest is they're consistent in terms of what they're telling us, and that the translational, the rotational dynamics of water in the vicinity of the polymer tethers is slowing. And it also tells us that the Zwitterionic tethers have a more significant impact on the mobility of water than those of the non-Zwitterionic polymers. And of course, if you make a connection between what we are observing here and what we are observing from in terms of the wetting behavior, there's consistency in the sense that those systems that we found to be highly hydrophilic, highly wetting, in other words, the ones that are associated with the Zwitterionic tethers are the same ones that have the most significant impact on the mobility of water in the vicinity of the polymer tethers. So there's consistency there in terms of what we're observing from both a thermodynamic perspective and a dynamics perspective. All right, the last part here, I'll just spend a few minutes on this. The last thing that Yichi did was to take a step back, and instead of looking at polysulfone as the base membrane surface, he instead looked at a system polymer that was more hydrophobic in nature. In essence, he wanted to get a better understanding of the impact of these different zwitterionic polymer chains on the wetting properties of the system. And so he looked at a system where the base polymer is polyethylene, again, much more hydrophobic. And then he looked at three different zwitterionic, all zwitterionic in this case, polymer tethers. The two of them are the same that you saw before, SBMA and CBMA. And then he looked at a third, we'll refer to as MPC. So this one is slightly different in the sense that now the anion is in the center and the cation is pushed out to the end of the polymer tether. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this case was to better understand how the grafting density of these polymer tethers impacted the wetting properties associated with the system. And so he constructed different systems that had 5 polymer tethers versus 10 versus 15 versus 20 and 25. And some of the sort of systems, what they look like, are captured here. I also won't get too much into this, but one of the things that we were faced when going to these systems was that these zwitterionic polymers can be difficult to sample. And so one of the things that Yichi developed was something referred to as the charge expanded ensemble. The basic idea is that you do a series of calculations where you turn the zwitterionic polymers into non-zwitterionic polymers, and you do a lot of the initial sampling with that type of approach. They sample much better than the zwitterionic ones. And then you go through this process in which you turn on the charges in various different scenarios. And in the end, it allows you to get the properties associated with the zwitterionic cases in a more efficient way. All right, so this is an example of the type of results that we get. So we go through a process that's similar to the one that I outlined before. The nuance is that we now have this additional sort of charge expanded ensemble component associated with it. But in the end, these are the results that we get for the cosine of the contact angle, in this case, at 300 Kelvin for systems with various different grafting densities. And again, we're capturing the results for different types of polymer tethers in this case. So one of the things that you notice relatively quickly is that a even modest grafting density, 5 tethers in this case, has a relatively significant impact on the change in the wetting properties associated with the system. So the base system is highly hydrophobic in this case, a contact angle that's greater than 120 degrees. And then by introducing 5 polymer tethers in this case, you take the contact angle to something that's significantly less than 90 degrees. As you add additional polymer tethers, you have sort of diminishing returns. In this case, the system gets very, very close to the wetting point once you get to on the vicinity of 20 or 25 tethers added to the system. The other thing to appreciate is that, similar to what we found before, the SBMA case has sort of the weakest impact. The CBMA and the new polymer that we're looking at here, MPC, have a stronger influence on the system. So at the end of this, one of the things that we were interested in was, okay, so we've gone through the calculations to determine the contact angle and how that evolves with these different grafting density. And we wanted to say, okay, well, instead of having to do all the calculations, is there a way to perhaps estimate or predict, based upon other information, what the wetting behavior of one of these systems would be with some arbitrary number of tethers grafted to the surface? So what we looked at was the possibility of applying ideas associated with Kesey's law in order to make such a prediction. And so what we did was to identify different regions and associated water with either the tether or with the base surface. And so just based upon an analysis of different snapshots of water in the vicinity of these different polymer tethers, we were able to determine the fraction of water in this case that is in the vicinity of a polymer tether versus that of the membrane. And the whole idea of Casey's law is to say that the cosine of the contact angle of a fluid on some composite surface, so a surface made up of multiple materials, is given by this linear combination of the surface fraction associated with the system 1 multiplied by the cosine of the contact angle, and the surface fraction of component 2 multiplied by that contact angle. And so in effect, what we were determining was the theta values associated with the tether and the theta value associated with the membrane. And then we put the data together to see the extent to which this Casey's law could be used to sort of capture how the contact angle evolves with this fractional area. And what we found was that this ends up being a very good predictor. So here are all of the data, and you can see that they sort of collapse in a linear way as a function of the fraction of the surface that's associated with the tether. And so that sort of linear dependence suggests that Casey's law is sort of a reasonable way, in this case, to estimate the contact angle associated with these composite systems. All right, I see we're running low on time, so I'll just stop here and acknowledge the sponsors of the work. So NSF was the one funding Ichi through much of it. We did get some initial funds in a project with Professor Lin through Stony Brook University, their Center for Clean Water Technology. And the computational components were provided by the Center for Computational Research. So thanks very much. Let me stop here.
Professor Jeffrey Errington, thank you so much for the presentation. We are now open to questions. If you want to participate, please enable your microphone or write it down at the chat and we will read it. Also, our YouTube viewers can write it down. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Professor Richard raised his hand. Please enable your microphone and feel free to ask the question yourself, Professor.
Hi, Jeff.
Richard, how are you?
Very good, very good. I had a few questions. I guess I should say what I'm thinking about is whether this kind of wetting constant could maybe be calculated through density functional theory or some sort of alternative theory instead of simulation, and that's what I've got in mind. So did you characterize the mass density as a function of z? Z being the distance from the perpendicular from the surface.
Yeah, so there have been groups that have looked at density functional theory. So Peter Monson has done a lot of work in that area using density functional theory with similar types of systems. I mean, he applied it to more basic types of systems than this, but the idea of using density functional theory, classical density functional theory, to predict the wetting properties, get these sorts of interface potentials has been done. The second question was about, so I think you're asking about what the what do you call it, the density profile, and yeah, so we did, I didn't highlight that here, but we did as a sort of regular matter capture the density profile during these simulations.
And it just kind of starts at a high number and decays, and then has kind of a steep drop off somewhere.
Right. So it depends upon which system you're looking at. So for the tethers, it actually is sort of at maybe half of the density to begin with, because the polymer tethers themselves are occupying some of the space in the cross section, and then you go through sort of a transition after you get to the ends of the polymer tethers, where the density sort of water goes to plateaus to the sort of normal density of the saturated liquid.
Okay.
For the non-grafted system, there's the base, because it's a bit rough, you have a little bit of that. Like, so the density profile sort of increases a little bit gradually, and then sort of plateaus out to a value associated with the saturated liquid density. And then you talked about the hydrogen bonds. What does the distribution of hydrogen bonds look like as a function of Z? Did you look at that? So I didn't show it here, but the results I showed here were more just aggregate along the entire polymer tether, but we did do analyses where we looked at things like the diffusion coefficient or water residence time, or the different dynamic properties on a per atom basis. So looking at the different atoms along the polymer chain, isolating them. And there were some interesting results that came of that, but I don't think that directly answers the question that you had. But I think we probably have that information, but I don't remember looking at it in detail. One last question is, so you talked about the way that you kind of built these membranes inside the simulation box. How are they built in real life? Are they synthesized in the absence of water at first? Haiqing told me at some point, and it's been a couple of years, I don't remember well. But it was, one of the things I do remember was it was difficult to, so one of the things we asked him was, okay, we can, like, let's say we create one of these surfaces, like, how many of these tethers should we put on the surface? In other words, like, what's the density? And that was something that they struggled to give us an answer to. And so it was sort of like, well, we'll try something. Okay. So yeah, I'd have to go back and ask Haiqing more about those questions. All right, thanks. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. Please, Professor Santo, enable your microphone and ask the question.
Hello. From your water dynamics analysis, it turns out that hydrogen bonding is mostly determined the wetting, right? So, but you say it's a Zwitterionic polymer. So, does that really matter the polymer to be Zwitterionic? If suppose you have a polymer with high hydrogen bonding capability, it will do the same thing, right? Or the second question is, have you checked how the chain length of the polymer affects the wetting process?
So the second part, we thought about that, but then ran out of time effectively. So we didn't end up exploring in any level of detail the impact of the length of the tether on the behavior. The first question, like, so yes, I think you're right in the sense that in this case, it was the two Zwitterionic ones that were showing these, higher impact in terms of the water mobility. But if it was a non-Zwitterionic one that did as well, I would expect that would correlate also with the wetting behavior associated with the system. So in that sense, I don't think that result is specific to the Zwitterionic nature of the system. It's just that in this case, the Zwitterionic ones were more impactful.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Professor Carlos, Claudio Habit.
Congratulations for your talk. Really raising a lot of interesting questions. I'm more on the membrane side. I'm curious about some aspect of first of all, did your student went to a new company to explore these results? This will answer my worries about how things will go in real life.
He's doing molecular simulation work in his new job, but not specifically these systems.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, when you built your model, I mean, this attaching of Zwitterion polymers, is this ionic bonding? Is this a covalent bonding? How one would expect association with this a promoter of a better performance of the membrane with a polymer-based membrane?
Can you repeat that question? I didn't follow that question. I'm sorry.
I mean, how would you promote association of the new polymer over the polysulfone membrane?
How do we?
Is this a chemical reaction? Is
Right. So in our case, like, we identified these sites where the polymer could naturally, the chemistry made sense to bond it to the base polysulfone surface. So we're basically looking for a carbon atom along one of the aromatic rings that's associated with the polysulfone. And we then put together attach the polymer tether in a way that preserves the sort of natural chemistry of the system. And then in terms of the interactions, we used amber as a way to get the force field parameters associated with the system. So there's a standard technique where you take the system, you give it to amber, and it comes back and tells you, okay, these are the partial charges that should be on this atom, and these are the Leonard-Jones parameters that you should use for these atoms. So we did that for the base surface, and then after we did this tethering, we did the same thing. We sent that structure back to amber, and it gives us the sort of force field parameters that we should use. And one can debate that particular method that amber uses or that, but it's a fairly standard now approach to doing that. And that's how we ended up with the parameters.
In the first slide you showed us, there is a permeability versus time performance data. This is a 3-hour performance, right? I mean, the stability of the system should be explored in a more permanent way, I mean, time of operation. So what was the system of the data you showed us? You remember the first slide?
Yep. So that comes from Haiqing Lin's group. So it wasn't something that our group generated. It was more of like what he provided us, explained to us. It was one of the things that motivated the work. But I would have to check with Professor Lin in terms of the specific details of how they did that.
Okay, and finally, there is no limitation if one want to go to the other side, say to provide a more hydrophobic structure. The same technique would be available to explore new structures, much more hydrophobic, as I say, a conventional hydrophobic polymer, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the methods that we used are fairly general. We've used that sort of overall interface potential type of approach to a number of different types of systems at this point. So yeah, I think that changing it to polymer type should be fine.
There is a lot of membrane application dealing with natural gas, liquid gas extraction that really would rely on a very good material, much more hydrophobic, so to reduce wetting. In fact, this is a point I want to make.
Yeah, I'd be interested in learning more about those systems and how molecular simulation could contribute, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I had not checked the question that were sent through the chat. So we have a question from our colleague, Hugen Lange. Please enable your microphone and ask the questions yourself. Let me see if he's still in the audience.
Yes, I can see them here. So the first question is, why not use the pressure tensor to derive the interfacial tensions and contact angles of the model system? So certainly that is an approach that one can use to determine the interfacial properties. Our experience or our reading of the literature in that case is that there can be nuances and difficulties in terms of calculating the pressure tensor with systems that are sort of complicated in the way that we had, and the results are also tend to be less precise than what one can get from the sort of free energy based approach that we use. That's based upon studies maybe 10 or 20 years ago that utilized simpler systems, Leonard-Jones types of systems, and came to those sorts of conclusions, and was one of the things that drove us to this sort of interface potential type of approach. The second question, is there any difference in results between this study and the functional theory of density with the classical theory of wettability? Have you tried the DFT approach? So no, we have not. That's related to the sort of one of the questions we had. One can apply density functional, classical density functional types of approaches to this work. We have not used that in the past. And then the last one, tip 6P has been shown to be a good water model, just like SPCE. Has tip 6P water model been tested? Certainly the water model that one works with is going to have an impact on the results. We were, selecting something that we thought would be reasonable, but certainly it would be interesting to look at the dependency of the results on other water models, and something like tip 6P that would be certainly interesting to check that out and see the influence. But we were more interested in questions that had to do with changing things other than the water model relative to probing in detail in terms of specific impacts on the from the force field.
Okay, we have another question at the chat from Professor Douros. Please enable your microphone, Professor Douros, and ask the question.
Thank you. Jeff, thank you very much. This was a great talk, and this is great work.
Doros, can you open your camera if you can?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, here I am. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Two things. First of all, I'm much more, used to using the pressure tensor that was mentioned previously, and that interface potential approach looked very powerful to me. So could you please explain what exactly you do? I mean, as I understand, you have the surface, which may be covered with polymer, and you have an upper bound in the simulation, in fact, as well, or use a sandwich of some sort?
Right. So in its most general form, you have the substrate or surface that you're interested in on one end. In the spreading type of approach, what you put at the top of the sandwich is a hard wall. So the fluid doesn't want anything to do with that interface. And so as you introduce fluid to the surface, it naturally wants to go to the substrate of interest. And as you add more water, in this case, or fluid to the system, then the fluid grows from the surface.
So this is done at a constant chemical potential, or do you vary the chemical potential?
It's done at a constant chemical potential, but we use transition matrix Monte Carlo, or you could use other types of techniques as well, but basically we impose a bias that allows you to sample within the grand canonical ensemble a wide range of different particle numbers. So if you, as you know, if you just specified a chemical potential and let the system naturally do what it wants to do in grand canonical, it's going to sample some relatively narrow range of particle numbers. So we impose a bias. We use the transition matrix Monte Carlo type of approach in our group to do that enables us to capture the particle number probability distribution over a wide range of particle numbers. Once you have that, it's a relatively straightforward conversion to go from that probability distribution to the free energy, in other words, the interface potential associated with this.
So this is really a grand potential of some sort. This what you call an interface potential. Is that a correct way of thinking of it?
Yep, that's right. It's a grand potential.
Okay. It's a grand potential. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Now, the second question is much more practical. In talking with industrial people, a big issue is whether these zwitterionic films should be thick. Sometimes they use these zwitterions in grafting. They have a main chain and they graft these zwitterions, and there are lots of them. And they try to build a very thick film on top of the surface. Now, based on your calculations, it doesn't seem that one would require a very thick film in order to get anti-fouling properties. I don't know whether you have thought about that. Is there an optimal thickness or, chain length for these grafted chains that should be used in applications? Yeah,
so that's related to one of the questions before. And so we would like, the short answer is we have not looked at that feature. The longer answer is we would like to look at that, but so I think it's a great question. One of the things that, from a practical perspective, the longer you make the polymer tether, the thicker the water film you need in a grand canonical simulation, the sort of larger the simulation box. But I certainly think we could go larger than what we were doing and still be comfortable in terms of being able to do the calculations with the resources that we have. So, and then
but you spoke with a law of diminishing returns at some point. I think even with very thin films, you do get very strong effects on localizing the water, at least.
Right. So that was the one that we looked at was the grafting density.
Yeah.
So if you have of identical tethers of the same height, and you say you put 5 on the surface versus 10 on the surface versus 20 on the surface, that was the one that we saw. Okay, just 5 has a significant impact, and then increasing it further, that's where you got the sort of diminishing returns.
Okay.
But you're asking, I think, a different question, which is if instead of you have 5 constant on there, but instead of having the tethers be 10 mer, they're 20 mer.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It was really great.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a comment from Professor Claudio Robert at the chat. He said that thicker films will compromise the permeability. So I cannot see any more questions. So
I have a short question.
Okay, go ahead, Professor Fred. Sorry.
You have shown us a figure that you define the thickness of the liquid film. How you define liquid in this sense?
Right. So here actually is where we use
because the structure of the fluid close to the wall is different from the bulk. So what exactly the thickness of this film?
Right, so it's an approximation where we basically take the number density associated with a given cross-sectional area, and we convert that into we convert that into we go from number to density, and then we convert that into the thickness. So I forget the exact formula now, but it's a relatively straightforward, once you have the density profile, you can relatively quickly.
Yeah, but you define a specific density that you say that, okay, from here, it's a liquid phase, and from that, it's not a liquid. Is it?
So the process I'm
you
describing is approximate in nature, but there's nothing about the conversion from particle number to film thickness that actually enters into the calculation of the spreading coefficient or drying coefficient. So it's just a cosmetic thing.
Yeah, I know. No, it's just a curiosity, just because of another problem. Okay, thank you.
So
Thank you.
now our time is almost over. I want to thank everyone for the discussion. And once again, thank you, Professor Jeffrey Errington, for the presentation.
Thank you. This has been great. Really appreciate it.
Our seminars are being recorded and posted on YouTube, of course, after the invited lectures agreement. Please check them out on our YouTube channel. This is our organization committee. We are responsible for inviting and communicating with the lecturers. We also handle social media, video editing, certificate rights, and hosting. Thank you all for being here today. See you next Thursday, June 3rd, on the seminar that will be given by Professor Mardonio Lucena, entitled New Developments in Microporous Materials Characterization Based on Molecular Simulation. So thank you all for being here today. See you next Thursday.